Hi there, you're back with a single malt review as we finish our foray through the compass box. We've reached the bottom of a box, though certainly not the bottom of a barrel. This one is a little bit different. For our fifth and final compass box, there's Hedonism.
Which is more than a little bit different. This is not quite a single grain, it's 2 grains in one, which makes it a blended grain Scotch whisky, which is not a term you're going to hear terrifically often. It's certainly the first time I've heard it in many a year. I think, off the top of my head, only... what is it? That whisky that's not very good. I think it's the John Haig something, comes in a blue flask, looks nice, but I haven't heard great things. Anyway, there's not a great many of them. This is probably the most mainstream and popular, being part of the, rightly so, very popular compass box range. It is composed of 60% lowland grain from the east and 40% lowland grain from the west, and these bringing different flavours to them. Apparently, one bringing caramel, the other bringing coconut and creme brulee, and the wood is 100% first fill American oak. So pretty identifiable stuff there.
So far, the other compass box whiskies we've tried have generally been at least 3 spirits and at least 2 types of cask. Here we have 2 spirits and only 1 cask, so be the most uniform out of all the ones we've tried in this range, at least.
And being single grain is going to be really, really quite different in terms of what it brings. Neither of us are particular experts on single grain whisky. I mean, you don't see it a great deal. I have tried the odd one. In fact, I've even tried some particularly old ones at tastings, but they're not exactly indicative of what you normally taste single grain in, which is cheaper blends. Well, or expensive blends for that matter. Blends full stop. They all have it in it, so it's an intrinsic part of the blended Scotch malt whisky, but, or rather, blended Scotch whisky. Not something that crops up on its own all too often. So to see it on its own like this, that's quite rare and should be quite a different flavour experience for us.
So 43%, about middle of the range as far as the compass box has gone so far, and 100% first fill bourbon, so I'm expecting a lot of wood influence.
Way more than usual. Because grain whiskies don't have as much individual character as malts themselves, by way of both the grains that they're made from and their method of distillation, you get a far more bare representation of the wood, which I think should be immediately obvious.
Right. Whoa.
And it is.
Yeah.
There's coconut rough is what you get out of here immediately.
A little coconut ice, even a slight hint of like turpentine, which sounds like a terrible thing to say, but I'm getting little whiffs of that kind of memories of cleaning paintbrushes in the workshop.
Certainly there's a lot of sweet spirit, but this is probably one of the most basic noses we've ever seen. Not to say it's bad, but it's very, very easy to describe it. You'd count the flavours off probably on one hand. There is coconut, hugely. There's
After all
vanilla.
the complex harmonies or sometimes discords of the rest of the compass box, this is so clear-cut and intense, but it's quite a contrast.
Really, it's coconut, it's vanilla, and it's sweetness, and that's tantamount to what it is. So it's a real testament to the sort of simplicity and the clarity by which grain whisky does its work.
Those of you who have bitten into a Bounty bar, you'll probably get some idea what I'm going with.
Bounty bar minus the chocolate. I think Bounty bar might only make sense to our non-US viewers, but it's essentially a sweet coconut ice chocolate bar, and if you were a Bounty bar pro, you'd eat the chocolate off on your first pass anyway, and then you'd just have the sweet, delicious coconutty goodness on the inside. Well, possibly that was just me, who knows, but anyway, this is quite striking in just how much it does taste like coconut. It's a real ensemble of exactly what bourbon barrels bring to the party without anything influencing them to any great degree. So that's the nose, and that's really all there is to say.
I have absolutely no idea how old this is, of course, only that it's been matured its entire life in those bourbon barrels. Oh, I like it. There is... I'm tasting, this is... For the first time, I'm tasting a lot of actual bourbon flavour in it. There's a lot of like...
there is a lot of bourbon. It's that vanilla spiciness.
Yeah.
The coconut is still here, although it's taken over more of a toasted coconut quality. The whole thing is still very, very sweet. It's like a creme brulee sweetness rather than a honey sweetness. That's probably how I describe the malt. The sweetness compared to a malt whiskey. Malt whiskey sweetness is quite a barley, honey sweetness. This is it's almost like a sucrose, sugar sweetness in here.
It's normally a heavily bourbon matured whiskey has a very strong, unique flavour of its own, but it doesn't just taste like bourbon. This time, though, I'm tasting a lot of actual bourbon flavour. In particular, not too long ago we reviewed a Blanton's bourbon, and I found very dry, much less sweet and sticky compared to most bourbons. And this is like that. Bourbon flavour with a lot of the sweetness stripped away. And hey, I'm impressed and beguiled.
It is very, very sort of dessert oriented. There's almost like a vanilla ice cream component to this. I don't think it's all that young, actually, because grain spirit, if anything, ages even more slowly than malt in terms of how long it takes to actually start tasting of something and get interesting, because it has such comparatively little flavour to begin with, and it's also quite prickly as well. Not quite as it doesn't have the fire that malt whiskey does, but you can certainly taste when a grain spirit is immature, and this one doesn't taste of that at all. So I'd say we're dealing with something at least 10 years old.
I'd be interested to know the average age of a whiskey in here. That's getting just a little water.
Yeah, I wouldn't have any trouble calling that a pretty superb example of grain spirit. Few of them that I've tried. It's certainly not something that only has to exist as a prop for blended whiskies. It doesn't have to be in with tandem with malt whiskey. I mean, it's arguably a better thing when it is, but as a standalone, as a single entity, I think there's nothing wrong with a properly aged, properly matured grain whiskey such as this. And I suppose Compass Box agree, because they've made a bottling from it.
I've got to derail the train of thought slightly and say you've got to try some water in there. That has turned it instantly from something that tastes sort of like a essence of bourbon soaked into some grain spirit to tasting much more like the first fill bourbon matured whiskies we've been trying a lot of lately. There's much more of a Scotch whisky character to it now. After a little water, it's enlivened something in there.
I think it's certainly made the flavours a lot fresher, and it's made it a little less sweet. There's a slightly more fresh bitterness to it now than there was before.
A little more of that lemon, some more of the fizzy citrus fruits.
I don't think it harms it, but I would tend to have it at full strength, just because that's when it is the most of what it is, the most sort of representative of that incredibly narrow but sort of deliciously moreish grain flavour.
Stick with confectionery metaphors. It's gone from being coconut ice and Bounty bars to sort of acid drops and lemon sherbet by adding that water. That's quite
it's pretty diverse drop there. That's actually really rather good. Although I'm torn as to whether to give it a. Really, you'd have to compare this against other grain whiskies, of which we might have done one. I don't know. We've forgotten. But if we have done any, they'll be very, very few and far between, as they are the world over. So don't compare the mark to anything else, in which I'm basically saying don't compare the mark to anything, so whatever. But we might do some more in the future, so it is of some relevance to score it, just for continuity's sake. And it's going to score pretty well for me. As a grain whiskey, so not to be compared intrinsically with malt whiskies, that's an 89 for me. That's really, really very pleasing, is probably the best I can say about it. It's an extremely pleasant whiskey. And it's very, very pleasant to see just what grain whiskey can do. What are your thoughts?
Well, rating this entirely based on how much I'm enjoying it now, how interesting it is, how complex. It is an 85. Well-rounded score for well-rounded, complex and curious, and hitherto fairly unique in our whiskey.
I think
experience.
it's the more I taste it, the more I really love this one. This is a very different thing, but I think it's a really, really well put together and well conceived thing. Difficult to know who it's really for. I think there's very, very, very few single grain fans out there, and like condolences to any there are, because they have very few whiskies to choose from, very few good ones as well. Although there's the odd independently bottled one these days, but. Certainly I'd recommend it for anyone that was the least bit curious as to what single grain tastes like on its own, and a really, really good version of it. Definitely better than the other sort of continuously released things. Whatever that... Oh, I wish I could remember the name of that John Haig one. Someone can catch me up on that one. Blue Flask looks like a big perfume bottle. Isn't particularly well regarded, but is otherwise the other grain spirit you can get. This one very, very recommended for people wanting to know sort of the lesser known aspects of what goes into really most of the world's Scotch whisky.
Well put together and well conceived. 2 words you used there, and I've got to agree that really describes the Compass Box selection overall. There's been quite some variety in these last 5 drams we've tried, and there's been a lot of care and a lot of thought has gone into how they've been constructed and blended and balanced. I'm really quite pleased overall, and especially having these detailed notes to rely on to see some of what we're trying.
Yeah, the notes, I mean, it's good whiskey, but if anything, the notes and the granularity and detail in these is what just really, really threw me, because they are so just a polar opposite to most whiskey packaging, which is very sort of, it gets a bit Shakespearean in terms of its, sort of praise and oblique nonsense that goes on the back. This actually has just the hard details, and that is something that is so rare within the world of whiskey, and bourbon for that matter. The hard science.
It is quantified, it's statistical, it's broken down into things you actually visualise and understand. Yeah.
So that, along with the rest of this the rest of this box here, I think is really, really something different and something really, really good. And this, I mean, we enjoyed this just fine, and we're sort of pretty inveterate whiskey drinkers ourselves, but this would just be excellent for anyone with even a little bit of whiskey knowledge or whiskey interest. It's obviously built as a sort of though it's more of a present to ourselves than anything else. It would make a really, really good gift box for anybody who was maybe not a whiskey beginner. It might be a bit much to really take on, but anyone who already enjoyed their malt whiskies, that just looks like a black obelisk, never mind. Anyone who already is enjoying their whiskies, this is something to really, really just push them over the edge, get them spinning away all the way down the whiskey abyss to join the rest of us. This is probably excellent. It's a really, really well put together thing. So
Compass Box have won a good few innovation awards.
Yeah, they have
over the years, and this is a good example of why they've definitely been innovating and experimenting and documenting, showing their working really to everyone's benefit, especially ours.
So yeah, this has been the Compass Box Whisky Company's sort of selection there, and hats off to them and Mr. John Glazier. I think it's a very, very good thing. If you're looking for other sort of gift boxes or sampler boxes, I believe Adelphi does one, and we encountered one from the Welsh Whisky Company, Penderyn, that's right. So they are floating around, and they are more or less a pretty good deal and a good way of tasting a lot of whiskies at once.
Without breaking the bank and without overloading your shelf with many litres of whiskey which you may or might not fully enjoy.
So, there you go. Anyway, this has been the Compass Box selection. This has been the Single Malt Review. I hope you have stuck with us till now and have found something of some worth to you in amongst that groaning heap of different whiskies. We'll be back with something a bit more individual. Maybe it's time for another bourbon, in fact, very, very soon. Slanger.
Slanger.